The Dialed In Angling Podcast presented by Onyx Fish, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Runnings, Visit Watertown, South Dakota, Mantrap Lake Lodge, and Visit Cook County. Well, it's sort of a curtain call for summer. I know fall is just around the corner from now. It's hard to believe that next weekend is Labor Day weekend. The Minnesota State Fair started today, Thursday. Unbelievable. I can't believe how quickly summer has flown by. It seems like every year summer goes quicker and quicker and quicker. You know, it feels like Memorial Day weekend wasn't too long ago. It feels like 4th of July was literally last weekend. And then boom, now we're looking forward to Labor Day weekend next weekend. Hard to believe that the State Fair has already started. Speaking of the State Fair, if you're down at the State Fair, swing on by the Minnesota Bound Cabin. There's a booth down there. I know Bill Shirk's going to be down there. Laura Shera, Ron Shera, Travis Frank. Swing on by, say hi to those guys if you're a fan of the podcast. Man, it's hard to believe that the Minnesota State Fair is right now. It feels like, you know, I have seen ads and Minnesota State Fair is something that I look forward to every year. I try to get down there at least once throughout the fair. I love going around, seeing the food, people watching, swinging by the Minnesota Bound booth. And then, of course, going to the Minnesota DNR booth where they've got the big fish pond, all of that stuff. Super cool. I've always enjoyed the fair ever since I've been a little kid. But the fair always kind of marks the end of summer for me, right? Like I said, there's already some kids going back to school. I saw some Facebook posts of people's kids going back to school. It's hard to believe that we're at that time frame. But, you know, a lot of people think we go from summer to fall, right? That right as we get into September, that there's this big stark change from summer to fall. And some years you do get a big cool down. Like this week, it looks like as we get into the weekend, we're going to have somewhat of a cold front moving in. We've had a few up and down days this week. I know Monday looking back, it was cold Monday. It was windy, blowing out of the northwest. So yes, you can sort of get that, you know, summer to fall change that happens very quickly, but it rarely ever happens, you know, right at Labor Day or just after Labor Day. You know, you always seem to get those nice warm days all the way into September. For me, like fall fishing doesn't really start till mid to late September at the earliest, where, you know, I start catching, you know, bass in their summer patterns. I start catching walleyes in their summer patterns. However, as we get towards late summer, you know, you start to get into some of these patterns for panfish anyway, where they start to slide out to the edge of the weed lines, even the edge of the basin. A lot of them will start to move as we get towards the wintering basin. And that's going to be sort of the focus of my podcast, is talking about, you know, late summer walleyes, because I'm doing a lot of that. I'll touch on some bass, but then of course I want to touch on late summer panfish and spend the bulk of my podcast really talking about that, because I love targeting panfish all season long. Whenever I get a day off, you know, I chase walleyes, you know, I chase bass all the time. If you listen to the podcast last week, I love taking time off and going fishing. Well, it's easier said than done. It's hard to get days off just to go fishing, but I spend a lot of time fishing with my son, and we both share a passion for pan fishing. So a lot of times after work, we'll slide over to a small lake, maybe in his little boat, or we'll take our pontoon out fishing, do a little pan fishing all season long. But it's just something that I can do in my free time to still fish and have a lot of fun doing it. Now, late summer pan fishing, you know, if you're out there, a lot of times you're fishing by yourself, because a lot of times as you get into spring and pretty much after Memorial Day weekend, you rarely see people out pan fishing unless it's somebody who's a real casual angler that's just throwing a bobber out or something like that. But there's not a lot of like hardcore panfish anglers out fishing them, you know, especially as you get past June, for example. You get into July and August, there's not a lot of people fishing in general, but there's not a lot of people fishing panfish. And it's one of the times a year that I really enjoy it. I like throwing a few different baits in the summer months. I'm going to touch on 3 of them right now that are like sort of my go-tos in the summer. And one would be crankbaits. I tend to do a lot of my summer pan fishing in the evenings when I get done guiding. I come home after work, get the lawn cut, maybe eat dinner, and then go out for like an evening cruise or something like that where we want to fish. Like, I don't like jumping in the boat and not fishing. And so always, if we're going like a sunset cruise on the pontoon, I'm bringing fishing rods. A lot of times we'll have a fishing contest, of course. Me and Robbie, it always becomes some sort of competition. But going out there in the evenings, one of my favorite things to do for late summer panfish is throwing crankbaits. If you've never thrown like a micro crankbait, Rapala makes some ultra cranks, some really small crankbaits, even a number 5 shad wrap. A lot of times you can fish them on the outside edge of the weed lines or even through the cabbage pretty easily. Whether you're using those ultralight cranks or like a small original floater is a great bait. Also the countdowns. If you're familiar with the countdown series, you throw them out there, you count down. It's basically 1, 2, 3. You start reeling, and that bait's gonna maintain that depth that it fell at. Another really good panfish crankbait. But if you've never thrown crankbaits, my advice to you is get a rod, like an ultralight rod, but something that is in that 7 foot or longer category. And then I like fishing crankbaits, those ultralight crankbaits, on a spinning reel with some sort of braid that's easy to throw, whether it's like a nano style braid, something of that nature, which you can really huck those baits out there. If you're using too heavy a braid or even really too heavy of monofilament, it's hard to get those baits out at a distance. It's okay to use mono, but if you are going to use mono, I like Suffolk Advanced Mono, for example, like a 4-pound or a 3-pound. What I like about that advanced mono for fishing is it's sort of low stretch, right? You can feel everything because it's low stretch with the advanced mono, and it casts really nicely. So if you want to throw crankbaits, that's sort of my setup. Either a really, really light style braid or go with something in that monofilament, like an advanced mono, where you're using either 2, 3, or 4-pound test. I like 3-pound test for a lot of different panfish applications. It seems to be sort of that happy medium between 2-pound test and 4-pound test, and it casts better than 4, but it holds up better than 2 when it comes to pike and bass and that sort of thing. Because I'm telling you, you throw an ultralight crankbait out there, expect a pike to hit it. Expect a bass to hit that bait. And if you're using 2-pound test, you're going to break off a lot of baits. So getting back to throwing them in the evenings is ideal. When those panfish start to rise up, if you can find an evening where it's super, super calm out, like glass out there, you get out to the edge of these weed lines this time of year, those panfish might be hunkered down at the depths, whether they're still in the cabbage or just up off of the cabbage or off of the weed lines. Sometimes they'll suspend 10, 15, 20 feet down. You get towards the evening, a lot of those fish will start to rise up. Same can be said about the mornings. If you get out there in the morning, it's dead flat calm. You'll see a lot of bait fish at the surface. You'll see a lot of panfish, a lot of crappies, big bluegills. They're up high feeding in the water column. The other day, Robbie and I were out fishing. We had forward-facing sonar out, and I couldn't believe the giant bluegills, not just the crappies that were suspended, but the giant bluegills that were sort of, they weren't in the big schools, like the big schools of small bluegills, there's big congregations of these little bluegills, but these giant bluegills that were all by themselves sort of roaming, kind of like walleyes or largemouth bass do this time of year, but they were by themselves off the edge of the weed line. We were throwing out these ultralight crankbaits and just cracking them, okay? And if you've never casted a crankbait for panfish, it's really fun. I'm giving you some examples. I mean, you can throw crankbaits all day long if you want for panfish and be successful for it. But I'm giving you time scenarios where I've been really successful, where you're catching tons and tons of crappies, tons of big bluegills. What's cool about throwing those ultralights is, first of all, the fish hit it, they're aggressive. You can fish them fast. So even if you don't have forward-facing sonar, you can kind of power fish along the weed lines, finding those active, aggressive panfish. And then, of course, when you're using these bigger size crankbaits, you don't have these little teeny gills hitting it. They might be bumping it. You might feel them bump it, but they can't get that treble hook in their mouth. One little piece of advice I can give you is that if you're specifically targeting bluegills, sometimes it's nice to put like a dressed treble on the back of that crankbait. Bluegills are really inefficient feeders, and a lot of times they'll just hit the bait like mid-body. But if you can dress that back treble hook, your hookup percentage gets way, way better. That's why I also like for ultralight cranks like that is like a small X-Wrap. They make a number 4, a number 6 X-Wrap. It's already got the dress treble on it. So a Rapala X-Wrap is a great bait to use. And you can fish it like a jerk bait, or you can fish it like a regular crankbait and just throw it out there and then reel it in. What's cool about casting crankbaits versus like trolling them is, if you get hooked up in the weeds, you can kind of snap it a little bit and get that bait moving again and sort of crank it back to the boat. And I should state that that's sort of the advantage to using braided line is you can feel a lot more than you can with mono. The trade-off with the monofilament is obviously it's, they can't see it as well, but also there is a little bit of stretch. So those crankbaits don't just pop right out of their mouths, especially crappies. I'll get into talking about using different line species later in the podcast when I talk about targeting some fish with, let's say, jigging wraps or something. But there's sort of a trade-off there. If you're using a really light braid, like an ultralight braid, like even like a Suffix makes a 131, which is a thinner diameter braid. They make a couple different thinner diameter braids, but throwing those versus a monofilament, you can feel everything. So if you get caught up in the cabbage, for example, or a lot of times this time of year, you got a lot of floating vegetation, whether it broke off from boats going by or it's just starting to die off. Like over the last few weeks, I've been seeing tons of eelgrass floating. You see, pieces of cabbage, whatever is floating in the water column. When you're throwing crankbaits, that can be a little bit problematic. But if you can feel them on there, especially with braid, here's the advantage. You can kind of snap that tip a little bit. A lot of times that vegetation will fall off, and then boom, you're right back to fishing. You don't have to ruin a cast. Monofilament, it's a little more challenging to do that, although with the advanced mono, it has a lot less stretch than regular monofilament, and so you can snap it a little bit. Like I said, the benefit of using mono would be the fact that you can't see it as well. And of course, it's got a little bit of stretch so that when those fish hit it, you're not ripping the treble hooks out of their mouth. So that's sort of the 1-2 punch. And a lot of times I'll have both rigged up. Now, if you are using a braid, I highly recommend using like a 4 or even it depends on the size of the crankbait, right? But 4 or 6 pound fluorocarbon leader. Now, what that's going to help you too is it sort of vanishes that braid a little bit. It gives you a little distance from that braid. Also, if you're like twitching your crankbaits, those crankbaits aren't going to come up and grab the braid. If you've got a little bit of fluorocarbon on there, you're not going to be catching that with your treble hook like you would be if you were twitching with regular braid. Almost always when I'm throwing crankbaits, I use a little chunk of fluorocarbon. What's nice about fluorocarbon as well is it's very abrasion resistant. So if you got those little small hammer handle pike, if you got, bass or whatever, you don't have to worry about breaking off if you're using a chunk of fluorocarbon. I will typically use anywhere from 2 to 4 feet, something where I'm comfortable casting, where I can still really get good distance with that crankbait on there. Because the key to casting crankbaits, not just for panfish, but any species of fish, is distance. Being able to get that out there, get that dive, especially if you're using, let's say, a number 4 shad wrap or a number 5 shad wrap or a countdown where you want that to sink down and then you can start retrieving and get a full retrieve. Distance is your friend. And so that's where using lighter species of line is going to help you. So stay tuned. We're going to take a quick break. I want to get more into late summer panfish patterns. I want to talk jigging wraps. I want to talk about throwing jigs and talk about these fish that are starting to pull off those weed lines and they're starting to relate to the wintering basins. It's not fall yet, but stay tuned. We've got more dialed in angling coming your way. Late summer panfish patterns. Stay tuned.
onX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Download the app today to get fisheries information in the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin, along with research tools for serious anglers and beginners alike. Filter lakes by species, trophy only, keeper fish, abundance, or all of the above. Plan which lakes to fish with the app, navigate to the accesses, and once you're there, use the onX best-in-class weather imagery and fishing hotspots to catch more fish. onX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you would never known existed. onX Fish, the app that is changing the game on ice.
Visit Cook County, Minnesota, a year-round fishing destination like no other. Spring brings steelhead and smelt runs along the Lake Superior shoreline. In summer, cast for walleye, lake trout, and northern pike in the region's inland lakes and rivers. As the leaves change, so does the fishing, with fall offering some of the best lake trout action around. When winter settles in, grab your gear and head out for ice fishing in a true northern wilderness setting. Whether you're an experienced angler or just discovering the joy of casting a line, Cook County has a spot and a season for you. Learn more and start planning your fishing trip at visitcookcounty.com.
Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site full-service bar and restaurant. The two beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. Okay, let's talk a little more about late summer panfish patterns. It truly is one of my favorite times a year to target panfish as they start to pull out to the basin, as they even move out to, let's say, some mid-lake structure like rock humps, that sort of thing. There's a couple key areas that you can look for panfish this time of year. Even though it's not fall on the calendar yet, these fish will start to pull off the weed lines, especially, next week we have this sort of cool down. Water temperatures are sort of in flux. Panfish can feel that. They're very sensitive to temperature changes. And so you're going to start to see some crappies, bluegills start to move out away from the weed lines. So they're going to actually pull off that weed edge and go towards some of those wintering basins. Now, they're not full blown into the basin yet. I mean, some lakes they might be, but I would also clarify that in some of these lakes that are deeper, they're stratified. They're really stratified. So a lot of these lakes have some sort of thermocline. So even if the fish pull off the edges, they're still suspended up in the water column, and a lot of them are, let's say, from the surface down to about 15 feet. But most lakes that I've been on over the last few weeks, if I do see panfish pulling off the weed lines on the edges of these wintering basins, they're either in two areas. One, it could be a rock pile, a mid-lake hump or something like that. Might have a little bit of vegetation on it, but it's got some rocks and boulders. I see bluegills pull out to these areas a lot this time of year. And then as far as the crappies, they'll actually pull off the weed line, but they're suspended, right? They're working up and down these weed edges during the daytime. Like I mentioned before, they might sink down in the weeds a little bit, especially if you got a lake with a deeper weed line. Or they'll pull off the edge and they'll sort of suspend, but they might only be 10 to 15 feet below the surface. And so A couple ways you can target them is, yes, crankbaits. I talked about countdowns, number 5 shad wraps, number 4 shad wraps, X wraps. You can still do all of that. However, if the fish are a little bit deeper, I rely on a couple different techniques. One would be small jigging wraps, like a number 3 or a number 5 jigging wrap. In dark water, I love like the UV colors, the UV pinks, the whites, the real bright colors, even pink squirrel. Look that color up. It's one of my favorites. I love pinks, for panfish and jigging wraps. If the water's a little bit clearer and, depending on the forage base, a lot of those crappies feed on young of the year perch. And this time of year, you start to see big schools of young of the year perch, and they're micro, right? If you've driven around these lakes, like I said earlier in the podcast, in the mornings or evenings, you'll see big schools of baitfish subsurface. And if you take a look at them, a lot of them are little young of the year perch. And so I'll use either a gold jigging wrap or like a perch pattern jigging wrap in that number 3 or number 5 size and throw it out there. Fish those pretty clean on the edges of those weed lines this time of year, using the same type of line species. There's a big debate out there whether, with jigging wraps, whether you should be using braid or whether you should be using monofilament. I'm sort of on the fence. With crappies, I typically use more braid, but again, I like using those smaller braids like the nano braid. One I should really mention is obviously the Suffix 131 or Suffix Revolve. That's a really small diameter braided line that works great if you're using small jigging wraps. Along those same lines of jigging wraps, if you're in really, really dirty water and the fish aren't that far down, I also like using either slab wraps or ripping wraps. If the water's super dirty, I use ripping wraps all the time. I love that buzz of the ripping wrap. The fish can feel it. They feel that vibration. I watch them on forward-facing sonar. It's amazing. Like even in really stained water, crappies kind of like, it's like they have this sixth sense around them, where you throw a jigging wrap out there or even a slab wrap or something in that horizontal presentation, ripping wrap, and you drop it down on them, they can feel that. And so with crappies, when I'm fishing them, I like to keep the baits above the fish. So when I throw it out there, I let that bait sink a little bit, but it's amazing. Those crappies can feel that with their lateral line. I mean, they have that, like, it's so cool watching them on forward facing sonar. It's almost like they have this sixth sense. And I realize that, they're super in tune with their environment, but on lakes, even where it's super stained, where you can't see, a foot into the water, they can feel these baits dropping down on them. And so I'll throw my bait out there, let it fall, but I'll close my bail prior to those fish coming up, especially if I start seeing those fish really, the trajectory of those fish like take off towards my bait. I'll close my bail and I'll start reeling, and I'm kind of just holding that bait, almost jiggling it very, very slowly back to the boat, just like I'm pendling, like it's a pendulum, right? And that jigging wrap is coming back to the boat, or that ripping wrap or slab wrap or whatever, bringing it back to the boat as a pendulum. And as I'm doing that, I'm slowly raising my rod tip, not to pull it away from that fish, but it drives them nuts. This time of year, it's just like winter. Like if you envision like fishing crappies on your 2D sonar, where you're dropping a bait above them and you see them shoot out of the pack to come hit it, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for big packs of panfish, big packs of crappies, where I'm throwing baits out there and then watching them come out of the pack and just absolutely annihilate that bait. That's what makes it fun. That's what late summer panfish is all about for me. As we get more and more into September and even into the fall, when vegetation starts to die off, that's when you see a giant migration of panfish out to the edges of these basins. They're just starting right now. And in some lakes, because we're advanced this year, there's been a lot of lakes that I've fished this year where, the lakes are really choked out with weeds. Well, when you get that sort of advanced weed growth, because we had an early spring and we've had a ton of light this summer, anytime you get those early springs, it always seems like the vegetation's like way more advanced than it should be this time of year. But you get cabbage busting the surface, you get weeds starting to die off. Like I talked about earlier in the podcast, if you start seeing a lot of floating vegetation out there, things are dying off. That's the time of year where you can start looking for these suspended schools of fish that are on the edge of your favorite wintering basin. And you can pick out a basin that you're familiar with. Like if this is your first time like targeting late summer panfish, it's a great time of year to do it. Labor Day weekend or, in the next few weeks is like the start of this great light season pattern. But if you start to see vegetation floating around, if you start to see, you don't have to see brown dead weeds yet. There's a lot of green weeds, but sort of that floating vegetation, like, hey man, things are starting to happen. You're not catching bluegills where you were before. You're not seeing them underneath docks. They're moving out to the edges, and you start targeting them anywhere in that 5 to 15 feet below the surface or 5 to 20 feet below the surface, right off the edge of the weed lines. And I'll start with the weed lines. If I'm not seeing them there, I'll move out even further. And like I said, don't overlook main lake humps that you have these beautiful main lake humps that are full of rocks that you'd think, man, this is like a textbook walleye spot. You get there midsummer like this, they are textbook giant panfish spots. Crappies love them. Bluegills love them. Rocks in particular. If you've got giant rocks in a lake that are out in the middle of the lake, especially these smaller bodies of water that are like panfish lakes, you're going to have big panfish around this time of year, I can promise you. So in addition to jigging wraps, crankbaits, I want to talk a little bit about soft plastics because I am a huge fan of soft plastics. I'm going to give you sort of my scenario for fishing plastics versus hard baits, okay? Plastics are great. The problem with plastics is I tend to fish them on a really light jig head, like a 16th ounce or smaller, right? Well, if these fish are down 10, 15 feet, you're dealing with a little bit of wind. You're trying to throw on top of them. Maybe you're using forward-facing sonar. Maybe you're just using 2D sonar below your trolling motor. It's hard to get that bait down there quickly before those schools move on. So, if they're out off the edge of these weed lines and they're out on the edge of these wintering basins, they're roaming. They're not relating to the structure. They're loosely relating to the structure, but they're roaming. And you'll see these fish that are moving on your forward-facing sonar when you're trying to hit a moving target with a really, really light bait, like a small plastic. That is where it becomes challenging. Now, you can do it if it's calm or if the school's big enough where you can toss it out there and you can wait for that bait to fall down on top of them. But if I'm getting fish that are moving super fast, they're all over in the water column, or they're at least all over up and down the weed lines or on the edge of these basins, that's where I rely on jigging wraps because I can get it out there, I can get it down there quickly, and I can get on top of those fish. However, if they are relating to the weed lines, or you do have lots of floating vegetation, or you have some, let's say, standing stock cabbage where the fish are maybe they're suspended, but they're down in that cabbage. I see that a lot on these high sun days, or when it's dead flat calm, they're up in the water column in the morning, and then they sort of sink down on the edges of those weed lines. They might be relating to the outside edge of the weed line, but they're still in the weeds. That's when I love throwing plastics because you can fish that thing clean, right? You're not going to foul that bait whatsoever. Throwing that 16th ounce plastic out there, especially in clear water, panfish can see that for a long ways. And if you've ever watched them on forward-facing sonar in open water, you throw that out there on a lake that's super clear, you'll watch crappies and bluegills just come out of nowhere to attack that bait. Another bait along those lines of using soft plastics, and there's a ton of different plastics out there nowadays. I am a huge fan of all the plastics that are out there. I think we've hit a point in fishing where the plastics have become so micro and so lifelike that they look lifelike. I mean, look at in the winter when we use these microplastics, like 13 makes those really nice small little plastics, any of those microplastics are the sort of the molding process, what they're using nowadays, they look alive. Another bait along those same lines of using a variety of plastics for panfish are hair jigs. I love using hair jigs for a lot of different species. I talk a lot about hair jigs in seminars when it comes to walleyes, when it comes to smallmouth bass. There's different types of hair jigs. Take a look at the roach jig, for example, from VMC. That's a real small micro hair jig that we designed for pan fishing in the winter months, but it is a fantastic jig in open water. There's other hair jigs like the moon eye jig, for example. We make a micro moon eye at VMC. We've got some really small marabou jigs. You can get them in 16, 32nd ounce. Any of those small hair jigs fish just as clean as plastics. And so, if you're looking to ramp up your arsenal and you've got a ton of plastics, take a look at some of these hair jigs because they fish just as good, if not better sometimes than some of these plastics. And they come in a lot of great colors. So I love fishing hair jigs right along with the plastics. Now, some of my favorite plastic vary from across the board. In addition to a lot of these manufacturers that make really good plastics that are lifelike, there's a lot of different plastics that are out there that I use. I would say in the summer months, depending on where you're at, but it's hard to beat that straight tail plastic. Even a small boot tail, like a small paddle tail, works fantastic on a 16th ounce jig, but also just that straight tail plastic. Anything in that straight tail design, fish love it, crappies love it, bluegills love it. The downfall of fishing some of those micros, you'll find out this time of year, because you're using lighter line, just like you are with your jigging wraps or your crankbaits and other presentations, is pike and bass. Pike and bass love those micros just as much as the panfish love them, and sometimes more. And a lot of the times, the reason that they love it so much is like what I talked about before. All the emergence of all the young of the year bait fish that are starting to look, in that 1.5, 2 inch category. Prime example of this, the other day I was out bass fishing on Mille Lacs, smallmouth bass fishing. And I was using like a sort of a what I would consider a straight tail plastic. It was the new Crush City jerk shad, right? And I put it on I was just using a Ned head, but I switched over and I rigged it so it was horizontal, and I was dropping it down and boom, catching smallmouth just horizontally, holding that bait right in front of their face. Some people call it moping, whatever, but I was dropping it in front of their face. I had a lot of fish that would come up and then not hit it. So I ended up putting a really tiny straight tail plastic. I had it rigged up from crappie fishing the other day when Robbie and I were all crappie fishing, but it was a straight tail plastic on a 16th ounce jig. I dropped it down there right in front of these smallmouth, and they absolutely attacked it. And I know bass anglers out there, a lot of bass anglers, like really good bass anglers, love using finesse style baits this time of year, but they also love using, sort of these sneaky finesse style baits on high pressure lakes as well. But it just opens up your eyes to, the amount of species you can catch just by throwing a plastic along a weed line, or throwing a hair jig along a weed line, crankbaits, jigging wraps. Don't forget to go pan fishing this time of year. If you're heading up to the cabin this weekend, it's Labor Day weekend, and things are busy, but you want to get out early in the morning, or you want to get out in the evening after all the boat traffic has been out there, and you want to do some fishing and be very successful, try some of these late summer patterns. I'm telling you, this time of year can be very, very challenging for walleyes, can be challenging even for largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, pike, because of the nature of where the fish are at, the water column, the busyness of some of these small lakes, for example. I see it firsthand. I fish, everything from Mille Lacs to Leech to Winnie to everything in between. I spend a lot of time in the Brainerd Lakes area, all around Aiken, you name it. These lakes that get a ton of boat traffic this time of year, especially on a holiday weekend. It becomes tough to go out there and say, hey, I'm going to go out and be very successful walleye fishing, for example, or even bass fishing. Try some of these late summer panfish patterns. You can get enough panfish to do a little fish fry for Labor Day weekend. You'll be a hero. Plus, you're going to have a lot of fun doing it. So that's what I have for panfish, late summer patterns. Hopefully, I gave you some insight into how I go about finding these fish, how I go about catching these fish, what types of line species I like using, and of course, what type of rod and reel I like using. Hey, stay tuned. We got more dialed in angling coming your way. We're going to shift gears, and we are going to talk a little bit about late summer walleyes, some of the other bites that I've been on. Stay tuned. We got more coming your way.
Man Trap Lodge, a Park Rapids resort on beautiful Big Man Trap Lake. Features 16 decked-out private cabins with air conditioning, Wi-Fi, and a rare Northwood swimming pool. Cabins are available with 1 to 5 bedroom units to select from. Whether you're looking for a fishing trip, a family vacation, or a family reunion, Man Trap Lodge is the Park Rapids resort for you. Rent one of our fishing boats for a great day of fishing or a pontoon to cruise around the lake and relax. Man Trap Lodge is a truly magical Minnesota vacation spot that's fun for the whole family. Don't miss your chance to book your late summer or fall trip at Man Trap Lodge for some fantastic fishing. Check us out at mantraplodge.com.
Runnings Home, Farm, and Outdoor stores are celebrating 78 years, serving 90 local communities across the Upper Midwest, the Northeast, and America's Heartland. Runnings has everything you and your family need for your home, on the farm, and in the outdoors. Lawn and garden, hardware, farm and ranch supplies, sporting goods, housewares, snacks, and everything for your pets. Go to runnings.com to find one of the 90 locations near you or shop online anytime at runnings.com. Runnings, your home, farm, and outdoor store.
Watertown, South Dakota is your hub for year-round fishing in the heart of the Glacial Lakes region. With Lakes Kempeska and Pelican right in town and dozens more just a short drive away, you'll find non-stop action for walleye, perch, and pike, just to name a few. When you're off the water, explore the Terry Redlin Art Center, Bramble Park Zoo, and many other great museums. Plus, award-winning pizza and family-friendly fun around every corner. Easy to reach, hard to leave. Plan your next cast at visitwatertownsd.com. So much Watertown, so little time.
Okay, for the final segment of this week's podcast, let's step away from pan fishing a little bit and talk a little more about late summer walleyes. We can touch on some bites that I've been on for walleyes all over Minnesota this past week. Have done some bass fishing as well. I've been on a bunch of different lakes, catching bass. You know, it seems like this time of year I'm catching bass and walleyes almost side by side, whether it's on the edges of these basins, some of these fish that are suspended, some of that are in the weed lines. A lot of these lakes that are like stocked lakes, right? The walleyes are out in the weeds. They're on the deep edge of the weed lines, but so are the largemouth bass. So are some of the smallmouth bass. Here's how I can kind of tell the difference between the three species in particular, because a lot of the lakes I fish in northern Minnesota, you have largemouth, you have smallmouth, and you have walleyes in the lake. And all of them are sort of relating to a lot of the same structure where you have rocks and weeds on top, or you just have really stark weed lines. And a lot of times you can tell the smallmouth bass because they're roamers. They spend a lot of time outside the weed lines, right? Whereas the walleyes and largemouth will be in the vegetation. They'll be sort of tucked down in there. The walleyes, a lot of times, will poke their heads out off the edge of the weed lines, not to say that they're not in there. Or you'll find, let's say, like a pocket within the weeds where some of these deeper weed lines get a little more sparse. You don't have that really hard weed edge. You've got sort of sparse weeds out there, and you'll see those walleyes kind of sitting down in there. Now, a lot of people think walleyes are down near the bottom. That's not the case. If you got a really clear lake with deep weed lines, let's say the weed edge goes out to 20, 25 feet, and then you have sporadic weeds out past that. Some of these walleyes will be suspended either out off the edge, or they'll be in those pockets, and they can be anywhere in the water column. So you can sort of spot those. Now, a lot of the largemouth can be in there as well. Now, if you have forward-facing sonar, if you throw on them, you can usually tell the difference on the mood of the fish. Like largemouth, for example, on clear lakes, I mean, they come unglued. I've had it where I've been in 25 feet of water and the weed lines go down towards the bottom, and I could see some fish up in there. As soon as my bait hit the water and got, in the top 4 feet of the surface, I've watched largemouth come out of the weeds at 20 feet of water and boom, hit your bait up at 4 feet. Now, walleyes can be very aggressive, but you won't see them move in the water column like that. Smallmouth bass, same thing. The other day I was throwing, it was pretty calm out. As soon as my bait hit the surface, I watched a smallmouth bass coming from about 15 feet down and hit my bait just subsurface. And so bass will tend to move more up and down in the water column like that than walleyes. I've been fooled a couple times, though. I've seen walleyes where they absolutely come unglued, like, throwing a bobber or like a jig with a night crawler on it and just working it back. I watched walleyes that were 10 feet down that came to the surface, and I thought, oh boy, here's a bass. And I set the hook, and it was a 4 or 5 pound walleye. So that's sort of how I kind of distinguish when I'm seeing them on forward-facing sonar. If you're new to forward-facing sonar, it's fun to be able to experiment with different species of fish so you can really gain knowledge of their movements, how they react to baits, what they're reacting to. There's some midsummer lures that I really like using for, let's start with walleyes, and then I'll shift over to bass. Because like I said, I've been all over the place. As a matter of fact, I was just down on Lake Minnetonka bass fishing. I never hardly ever fished down there. Rapid Marine had their kind of customer appreciation tournament. It was like 15 or so boats or 20 boats. I was down in Lake Minnetonka. That lake's super cool. We can get into that. Travis Frank won it. He got a couple of nice big largemouth to win that tournament. So hats off to Travis. We'll get into that in a minute. But let me talk about a couple of my favorite go-tos this time of year for late summer. One, still, if you've got forward-facing sonar, it's hard to beat using slip bobbers at certain times of year. Now, you'll know pretty quickly, like if you throw a slip bobber out there with a leech or a night crawler on it, you drop that bait in front of the 4 or 5 or 6 fish's face and they're not eating, it's time to put away the bobbers and do something different. What I like doing is using jig wraps. Now, how I effectively throw jig wraps on the edge of weeds or on lakes that have a lot of vegetation this time of year is I do kind of the float technique where I'll throw it out there. I'll let that jig wrap drop. I stop it just above them, and I kind of run that jig wrap through those walleyes or in front of those walleyes' face and get them to chase it like a crankbait. Now, this is going to require you to use a little bit longer cast. You're not going to be able to just drop next to the boat to do this technique. You got to be able to throw it out there 20, 30, 40, ideally 50, 60 feet. But what's cool is when you're throwing that at that distance, you can get really accurate with a jigging wrap. Okay. But you can also see it really well on forward-facing sonar. And so if you got walleyes out at 50, 60 feet, but there is a little bit of vegetation, so you know that you don't want to let that jig wrap hit the bottom, I'll throw it out there just above those fish. I'll slow it down before them, and then I start working that jigging wrap back to the boat, swimming it, okay? Swimming it. And if, depending on how fast the fish are swimming after it, will kind of dictate the speed. Like if I see a fish that really rushes at it, I'll almost act like I'm pulling it away from those fish. Just like I was talking earlier with the jig wraps for the panfish, if a fish is rocketing up to the bait, I'll just continue that momentum away from them like a cat and mouse game, like that bait's getting away from them. And then they'll, lo and behold, you'll see those walleyes come up and strike it. But the scenario that's more real than that is the walleyes will chase it out of the weeds, out off the edge of the weed line, right? And you can get them to chase. If you're getting near the boat and you're running out of space and they're not biting it, dump that jigging wrap all the way down to the bottom. It's amazing how walleyes will chase off a weed line like that and follow that bait all the way to the bottom. Even in lakes where you have thermocline. Like I have fished lakes, I don't know, the last 2 to 3 weeks where I'm swimming jigging wraps back to the boat, but there's a thermocline that started at like 17 to 18 feet. Walleyes didn't care. They followed that jig wrap right through that thermocline into 24, 25 feet of water, so 10 feet into the thermocline to hit that bait. That is a fun way to fish. Now, a couple of my go-to sizes would be, or ideal sizes for fishing jig wraps with walleyes in this manner. And really, some of my go-to sizes for fishing jig wraps anytime is a number 5, a number 7, and a number 9. Now, Rapala just came out with a number 11 jigging wrap. I don't know if you saw that or not. They used to have the old number 11s. One of my early podcasts when when I was talking about all the baits that had gotten dropped from ICAST. ICAST is a big national fishing convention. I had mentioned the number 11 jigging wraps because those used to be around years ago and then went away. Now they're back. People that fish heavy current, people that are fishing the Great Lakes, Lake of the Woods, throwing these baits and swimming them, all going to be in play for using those number 11s, those number 9s. I love jig wrap fishing. I love throwing, even if you don't have forward-facing sonar, if you've never fished a jig wrap for walleyes, get out to a lake that doesn't have a lot of vegetation right now, fish some mid-lake humps, throw it out there, snap it, let it hit the bottom, snap it, let it hit the bottom. You're going to bring back walleyes, and you catch everything. Everything loves jigging wraps. They look realistic. They swim realistic. And if you're swimming those baits back to the boat, you're going to catch panfish on them. You're going to catch walleyes. You're going to catch everything. It's amazing. Even like a number 7 jigging wrap, I've caught so many crappies on that big number 7. You wouldn't think they would hit it. They love it. Number 7 jigging wrap, giant jumbo perch. Love it. Absolutely crush it. Largemouth, smallmouth, walleyes. Love jigging wraps. This is the time of year to fish jigging wraps. When you float baits in front of fish's face and they won't actively feed, now it's time to start floating jigging wraps and putting fish in the boat. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up walleyes. Just want to touch on bass real quick in that same manner. A lot of these bass are starting to shift out to these mid-lake humps. If you're not getting them below the docks, you're not getting them up in the vegetation where you were a few weeks ago. Push a little bit deeper. Things are starting to happen in the sense that we're still in the summer, even though Labor Day is next weekend. The calendar says, or a lot of people, the kids go back to school, they think fall. September is still just sort of like summer 2.0, where the first few weeks in September, you're going to be using a lot of these same patterns that I'm talking about right now. So, and they're just as current, and they get better and better as you move into mid-September. And then typically, over the last few falls anyway, we've had a little bit warmer falls where we've had an extended summer, if you will. But if we get a normal fall like we're used to seeing, surface temperatures start to drop really rapidly as you get towards the end of September. And that's for a couple of things. One, the days get so much shorter that it's much cooler at night. And the longer the nights are, the cooler that surface temp is going to get. But also, as we get into late September, early October, you start to turn that hard corner where you're not getting the sun doesn't have as much power. You're not getting those, 70, 80 degree days like you were in early September. And so that, to me, is when fall starts. So just because Labor Day is next weekend doesn't mean there's not a ton of fishing to be had. Make sure you winterize your boat, but don't winterize it right on Labor Day. I see people pulling their docks out, pulling their boats out. That's fine. I mean, you could put the speed boats away, but keep the fishing boats out. There's tons of good fall fishing to come. If you've never experienced fall fishing, I'm going to talk about different techniques over the next month and a half, where it's absolutely my favorite time of year to fish. We're not quite there yet. We're still in these late summer patterns, but you can have a lot of fun going out catching fish this time of year. You just have to start thinking a little bit like fall fishing, and you're going to do better. So thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate everybody listening each and every week. Hopefully you can get out there and enjoy a little bit of last call for summer type of patterns before the kids go back to school. Hopefully, if you go down to the state fair, say hi to the Minnesota Bound crew, swing on in there, enjoy some food, enjoy the last few weeks while we have it of summer. Because guess what? The clock is winding down just as quickly as we got to this point. next thing you know, we're going to be talking ice. So thanks for tuning in. Until next week, I'm Tony Roach. This has been the Dialed In Angling Podcast.